So that was our discussion of old institutional economics, and I hope that you're starting to understand that economies rely a lot on different parts of society to even exist. And of course, we call these things institutions, and economists have come to study them much more in recent academic history. Now we're going to look at the next step, new institutional economics, sort of a newer form, a newer way to describe institutions. And I say newer again, but not necessarily better. And old institutional economics is actually more recently making a comeback because it seems to explain a lot of things in a more realistic way. But there are some very good insights that come from new institutional economics. And what is it? Well, let's look at this quote by Hodgson from 2001. The new institutionalist project is the attempt to explain the emergence of institutions, such as the firm or the state, by reference to a model of rational individual behavior. They start with Homo economicus, that greedy, selfish human model of human that has stable preferences that don't change, and they just want more of what they want. That's the model they start with. That makes quite a bit of sense because for economists, there is one great cost associated to expanding your model of human to more accurately describe what a human really is. So to use Homo socioeconomic, or sociologicus, I guess I'll say. There's a great cost to economists of that. And that cost is it's hard to do math on real humans. But if you assume a kind of atom that just wants to go in a direction, you can do that differential calculus, you can find equilibrium points and things like that. It lends itself to mathematics. And this is very appealing to economists, especially those trained in the neoclassical mode. So it made sense that they would start to try and describe institutions based on Homo economicus. New institutional economics came up around the same time, a little bit later than sort of neoclassical economics reasserted its popularity in 1980s, 1990s, 2000. That's when new institutional economics really kind of rose up. And the idea was, yeah, we all agree at that time in neoclassical economics. We agree that Homo economicus is a thing and markets are kind of natural, et cetera, et cetera. But when we look around, there are so many institutions, it's kind of hard to explain those away. Like, do we just ignore those things? So as we'll see, some attempts were made actually to ignore those things, but then eventually there had to be a theory of institutions that arose from this neoclassical model, and that was new institutional economics. Now, basically, the idea is that it is a form of neoclassical economics, but it allows that there is market failure or market frictions in some instances, and that institutions are required to correct for these subtle market failures and subtle market frictions. They're built purposely, the institutions, I guess. Yeah, they're built purposely by Homo economicus to solve these kind of problems that markets tend to get themselves into. Let's look at an example. A lot of examples of new institutional explanations of institutions come from collective action problems, and we'll explain this picture in a moment. Often this is called a prisoner's dilemma. A prisoner's dilemma really is a form of collective action problem, and it's probably the simplest form to understand. So if you're having difficulty understanding this sort of collective action problem, you could go Google any example of a prisoner's dilemma and you'll find your answers there. Now, in this example of any collective action problem, you have individuals acting in their own self-interest, Homo economicus. They want stuff and they're going to go get it. But in a collective action problem, we find that acting in your self-interest leads to a worse outcome We find this actually all over the world, and this is why it had to be explained by new institutionalists. And cooperation through institutions can solve this collective action problem. So therefore, new institutionalist economists say a rational Homo economicus makes institutions because that institution enforcing cooperation or something will solve the problem of a worse outcome in a free market. So here's a good example. 2 fishermen, 1 lake with fish. Imagine that situation. There's only 2 fishermen that live near this lake, and it has fish in it, and that's what they need to survive. They can each choose to overfish this lake, take more or take a smaller amount. If they take an agreed upon smaller amount, they'll avoid overfishing the entire lake and losing the fish stock altogether. A rational Homo economicus will always choose to take as much as possible in this state in a simple model. Each fisherman will go out there and fish as much as they can, because if they know if they don't catch the fish, the other guy's just going to catch the fish, essentially. So both fishermen in this model have incentive to take more. But the better collective long-term outcome is to take less fish each. So let's put it in numbers and see what I mean. In this picture here, I've got fisher 1. So this top part of the graph, this is fisher 1 and their choices. They can choose to take less fish each day or take more, kind of overfish each day, take as much fish as they can get. Fisher 2 has the exact same choices. They can take less fish each day or take more. When they both take less, that's lands you in this box right here. And they can day after day maybe take 10 fish each. They're each just fishing until they get 10 fish, and then they're saying, okay, I'm fine. But if you're fisher 1, these are their choices. In that case, you know that other person is taking 10 fish. So you know that you can actually decide to take more and you get more fish. You're going to get 15 fish, and maybe only a few fish will be left for that other fisherman. The other fisherman, being a Homo economicus, has the same choice, and they might decide to take more because, yeah, they could agree and have this sort of abide to this unspoken contract that you each take a little less fish, but they also could just take 15 fish and get more. And this is made worse by the fact that each other person knows the other person is a Homo economicus, a selfish fisher, and they expect the other person to overfish. So if that other person is overfishing, I'm going to overfish because I don't want to be left with just 3 fish. So I want to get as many as I can. This choice of both fishers to take more, both fishers to overfish, so to speak, leads to a long-term equilibrium, in this case, of 0 fish. They collapse the market. But you notice the incentive structure is as such so that only this is the equilibrium, the stable equilibrium that this particular market, the market for fish and fishing, will tend to. So what's needed is something outside of this market to help those fishers find their way to this equilibrium when they can each get 10 fish in perpetuity into the future. Turns out what happens is institutions emerge. Maybe it's just an agreement between these 2 fishermen. Maybe it's a cultural norm. Those who take more fish than 10 are going to be punished by the gods. Maybe there's contracts. They develop a contract system. Maybe a government is there and imposes a law. Any of these institutions can get the market back to this actually optimal point instead of this suboptimal but equilibrium tendency. So that's how collective action programs work, problems, and when we look for them, we find them everywhere in the world. And according to new institutional economists, that explains why so many institutions have emerged in that world. Another insight of new institutional economics is transaction costs, based on this idea of transaction costs. New institutional economists had a problem. Like I said, they were associated with neoclassical economics. They start with this idea of homo economicus. They start with the idea that markets work to find equilibria. But they look around and they find the largest actors in what they call the free market are actually institutions, firms, companies, corporations. Those are large institutions that don't just interact internally through prices. They have rules and laws. As a matter of fact, those institutions, some of the largest in the world and essential for free market economics, are top-down authoritarian dictatorships. Look at any company. That's not a democracy. The CEO's in charge, or the board of directors above them, and the stockholders, the wealthiest of them, and then they give orders down the system through managers. So that's an authoritarian dictatorship, and those are the core of the capitalist system, all these corporations. And we know for a time, neoclassical economists sort of got over that problem of the free market being inhabited by totalitarian institutions. They got over that by naming those institutions the same as individuals. They assumed firms acted like individuals. And even firms became, they created laws to create firms and give them the rights of individuals. That explanation only went so far, and you could see economists looking around and seeing this institution everywhere and having to explain why it would arise in a free market. To do that, economists came up with the idea of transaction costs. Okay, so normally in a market, people's incentive is just to buy and sell and interact through prices. In that case, firms shouldn't exist because you're just a bunch of individuals buying and selling goods. To create some sort of output, a firm shouldn't be necessary. But if information is costly and it's better to talk with somebody who's close nearby or even have meetings and collaborate, if there are cooperation problems within the firm, that it's a better outcome to collaborate than to go on pure selfishness, or if there are transaction costs like transportation costs that make it better to say manufacture essential parts in your production internally in your company as compared to buy it from the best competitor outside the company. All those can create an incentive to have an institution that's internal and that is governed by authoritarian tendencies, essentially. And that's how institutions like companies tended to emerge. And they were really important. Companies, firms, corporations, I should say, of the 100 largest economic institutions in the world, 70 of those are companies, and only about 30 are countries. So most of our economic institutions or corporations are larger than governments. So it's something big that had to be discovered. So that's how they explained the existence of firms. Then neoclassical economists also had to turn themselves to the question of government. Okay, why does government have to exist? And we kind of got to that with the coordination problem, right? The collective action problem, prisoner's dilemma. You have a suboptimal outcome with homo economicus, selfish behavior, market-based behavior. So you need some sort of institution to push people to the cooperative optimal situation. And a government, first a governance system, maybe informal, and eventual full-fledged government with laws might emerge to correct for those sort of situations. It's also, and it's expensive for individuals to enforce all property rights and things like that, and contracts, and that might be related with those collective action problems. It's expensive for firms to provide the basic income and health care and policing and security to their entire workforce and their entire population. So they often have to cooperate by paying taxes to get an outside agency, a government, to train the workforce to be basically literate and numerate, to make sure their workforce is healthy enough to work for them, and to provide security for their investments in the form of police forces and militaries. And there's all forms also need to use public goods like roads. Roads are a public good. We'll get to this in another lecture in more detail. Everybody needs them. Firms need them in order to get their goods to market and get their employees to work and things like that. But nobody wants to pay for them. And if people do start paying to have a road, it's easy for one company to sort of sit back, be what's called a free rider, and say, no, I'll let everybody else pay for that road, and then I'll get to use the road. While the government might have to come in there and enforce that, no, we'll all pay for the road collectively through taxes. And that's how governments emerged, according to new institutional economists. Another concept from new institutional economics is this bounded rationality. In a sense, new institutional economists were trying to use the Homo economicus model to explain all institutions. So then they had to address a big one. Why does culture exist? Why do norms exist? And their solution was that Homo economicus has limited time, information, and cognitive ability. So what they rely on are habits that they get from norms and rules of thumb and cultural norms to make decisions. They're not actually making rational decisions because really, although they'd like to, Homo economicus, they just have limited information. They don't know everything about everything all the time. And it takes a lot of time to make a rational decision, and Homo economicus doesn't tend to have a lot of time, and Homo economicus is not entirely the smartest human form ever to exist, so they struggle with their cognitive ability sometimes. So as a result, you get habits, rules of thumb. When this happens, I do this. When this happens, I do this. It's not rational thinking, it's habitual thinking, but it becomes faster. Habitual thinking is faster, so therefore it's efficient in that way. So that's the idea of bounded rationality. We have rationality, but it's bounded by our limitations. It should be starting to get obvious that all of these institutions that are built in this new institutionalist model, whether they're to solve coordination problems or this bounded rationality issue or transaction costs, they might be efficient at one time, but then maybe something can change in the society and all of a sudden you're stuck in this tradition that might be suboptimal. Maybe times change and those agreements you had in the past, that culture you had in the past, doesn't work anymore. So there's a lot of literature in new institutional economics trying to decide, well, is this institution optimal or suboptimal? Has it been antiquated by a change in modern society, or does it still function well? Which are good institutions and which are bad institutions? There's a lot of research that can be done in that area. Another related concept is social capital. Okay, and this is from Robert Putnam. He sort of initiated the big conversation about social capital with his book Bowling Alone. Now, markets need information and trust to exist, if you think of it. If you're going to hire somebody to do a job, you have to trust them to do that job. If you're going to buy something in a shop, or you're going to have a shop and regularly ask people to buy things from you, you want to trust that they're not going to just rob you all the time. So there's a certain amount of trust involved in having a functioning market economy. And you need particular information as well. What are the prices? Where are the best opportunities? And then things like this. Putnam invented this sort of Morpheus idea of social capital as the thing that contains that information and trust and brings it to people. Now, people also require collaboration when there are collective action problems. So, according to Putnam and people following social capital literature from the new institutional economics perspective, humans interact and create cultural practices to facilitate this trust and collaboration and information transfer. And Putnam's book was called Bowling Alone because he made the argument that these sort of clubs, bowling clubs that used to exist, and sort of social institution, even churches and things like that, brought people together and they talked and they built this trust and they shared information, and that made economies work better. It also made democracy work better, to take this into political science. That was the argument. They've noted two main types of social capital. The first is bonding social capital, and that's kind of what I just described. You have clubs, you have a community, people are talking, they get to trust one another, and they share information about opportunities and ways to collaborate to get, optimal equilibria and things like that. So within groups and civic organizations and leisure groups, that you cement those bonds and you exchange that information. That's bonding social capital. Then there's bridging social capital. That's when information from other groups is economically valuable. Connections between individuals in each group allows better information to flow, leading to opportunity, trust, and collaboration on a wider level. So you can get information and collaborate across groups, and that's bridging social capital. Maybe there's opportunities in one town that don't exist in another, and you don't know that unless you have sort of lines of communication between the towns, between some individuals in the town. That bridge brings economic opportunity. And studies have shown that more social capital leads to better economic outcomes and to better governance as well. So let's turn now and look at an example of a very serious problem and see how institutional economics might address that and help us trying to figure our way out of that problem. And I'm going to look at the example of this, what's called the solo paradox. This is called a paradox because it's not solved yet. Economists are working on it quite hard from various schools of thought. And what we really need are a lot more studies, a lot more economists doing studies, social scientists in general doing studies to try and figure out how to solve this paradox, because it is central to the main operating elements of our civilization. And it is so crucial for business to understand what this paradox means, as well as government, that it really requires a lot of intellectual energy to be put toward it. So what is the solo paradox? And then we'll look at how institutional economists might try and address it. Maybe you'll remember this guy, Robert Solow. We talked about him when we were talking about the neoclassical theory of how economic growth happens. And if you'll remember, Robert Solow did a study to try and figure out the sources of economic growth. And he was able to use sort of the normal variables you would put in such an equation to understand 30% of the growth. But there was this remaining 70% that became called the Solow residual. He just couldn't explain it, but 70% of the economic growth that had occurred in the economy. That residual was assumed to represent technology. It was thought like, well, we described everything we rationally can theorize that might grow an economy other than tech, because we couldn't measure it very well. So it must be tech that grows the economy, and it's responsible for 70% of economic growth. The Solow residual, right? Technology is responsible for creating 70% of economic growth. How does it do this? Technology raises productivity of every worker. Remember before, when we were talking about productivity per worker, the neoclassical idea is that a worker who's building houses with his bare hand is a lot less productive than a worker with the new technology of a hammer. So a hammer will make that one worker much more productive. If all the workers have this new technology hammer, you will see economic growth, technologically induced. That was the theory. And that the theory was that this technological change induced 70% of the economic growth that we see. So Robert Solow, of course, wanted to continue with his study, and he was very interested in showing this impact of technology on economic growth. And one of the most obvious places to look was the computer age. In 1987, especially around that period, personal computers were proliferating. They were to be the new great technological, almost industrial revolution. The computer revolution was supposed to increase productivity massively, and businesses were jumping to get compute, and so were individuals in their households jumping to get computers in their households. And of course, our society right now is based on the computer. And the assumption that we have based on neoclassical theory is that that must have made us much more productive. All of a sudden, we have this super tool called the computer. But Robert Solow looked in the productivity figures for the computer age, and he said this famous quote about it. You can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. That's the paradox. How can you have this massive increase of technology? Technology is supposed to cause economic growth, yet this huge innovation, the computer, did not increase productivity at all. We can look at this graph and see that happening, right? So there's a lot of interesting things in this graph, and we're going to touch on the Solow paradox a number of times going through this course because it's an interesting example to show where we need study in economics and where neoclassical economics isn't giving us the answers that we need. So here is total factor productivity in general, over from 1947 to 2007. And this is how fast it's growing. Productivity sort of naturally grows each year. So this is how much it grew from 1947 to 1977. If you're observant, you should notice that this is the period between the Second World War up until neoclassical economics started to dictate economic policy through neoliberal policies in the global economy. So you can see this point around the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, where all of a sudden productivity almost stopped growing altogether and never really started to grow in any significant way at all in the globe. So you can recognize maybe a global productivity crisis starting here, and it still hasn't ended. Now, you can think of a couple of good explanations for this general trend in productivity dropping off. One is, well, look at the policy. Maybe it was that neoliberal, neoclassical-based policy of free market economics in the globe that just didn't work and didn't produce productivity. Maybe you need government investments in education, science, training, starting up new businesses, new tech, in innovation to make technology increase and to make economic growth increase. That's possible. Another explanation is, well, oil prices got really expensive around this time. So maybe economic systems and growth of productivity are just a function of how cheap your energy is. And if you have cheap energy, you're putting a lot of cheap energy into the system. It's got a lot of fuel in the fire. It goes fast. And when the energy gets expensive, maybe your productivity is reduced. And a lot of economists are looking at these questions. We're going to touch on them again in the course to see how that fleshes out. But for now, we're interested in the part that Solow was looking at. That is, he was looking after this drop-off in this line, and right here where this first arrow is the widespread adoption of personal computers. That's where you would expect to see a massive increase in productivity. The promises at that time were essentially that computers are going to revolutionize productivity so much that people would probably eventually only have to work half days to get the same productivity, and we'll all have a society of leisure going forward. You know that we didn't get that, but it might have something to do with computers not bringing any measurable increase in productivity. So That's the paradox there. And there are other options to look at that you see the same paradox, the widespread adoption of the internet. The internet came with the same tech promise. We're going to increase productivity enormously with internet technology. So we have widespread adoption of the internet around the turn of the century. Not really any blip on productivity. It's still much lower increases than happened between the war and the 1980s, and not really able to see it. You aren't really able to see it on this graph. I know you can see, though, productivity does increase a little bit after that point. So there was a little bit of a time when people said, okay, maybe productivity increases not of personal computers, but of the internet. Maybe that was just a little bit delayed, and that's why we didn't see it initially. But I've found an extension of this graph here and put it here up to 2015, and you can see here's the little bump where it bumps up productivity and then it just goes back down and flattens out again. So that was just sort of an ephemeral bump that didn't really indicate massive productivity increases. So the Solow paradox still stands for the adoption of the internet, no increase of productivity. And what's worse, a new study, newer study from MIT suggested that 95% of AI pilot projects have failed. And AI is the new industrial revolution. It is supposed to revolutionize productivity, except it hasn't. And we can't find any evidence that AI as well is increasing productivity. So what is this? How do we solve this problem economically? Why can't we see this massive increase in productivity that computers, the internet, and AI were supposed to give us? Well, let's look at possible explanations for the Solow paradox. First, the classical neoclassical explanation. What does neoclassical economics say about this sort of thing? Well, businesses and people are rational and are adopting new tech because it's useful. So you better believe they're making rational decisions. They're not stupid. They're homo economicus. They have all this information and they're rational actors. Now, maybe then we just don't know how to measure productivity increases well enough, but they must be there somewhere. As you notice, it's kind of a weak way to address the paradox. It's just like, well, it's got to be there. I know we don't see it, but it's got to be there. Maybe we made a mistake. Enough people have gone over these data that we know there's probably not a mistake. We might look at it a few different ways and catch something little here and there. And there are some studies that maybe there's a little jump here and there, but not enough to explain the full paradox yet. We need more study here for sure. Measurement error could be part of it. That's the neoclassical excuse for the paradox. What would institutional economics suggest? Well, let's look at some of those concepts we just went over. Bounded rationality. People aren't very smart. They're not good at processing information. They have to rely on rules of thumbs. So if we think of people as having limited capacity to process information, then we can say, well, what has new technology, computer technology, generated? It's generated a lot of information. And maybe it generated so much new information that things just got so complicated and confusing that our growth didn't accelerate. We didn't have increased productivity because all that new information is just gumming up our thought and our decision making. Bounded rationality. So we need people to study that, don't we? Transaction costs might be it. Maybe the cost is too high to tell maybe good information from bad information. So that system fails. If we are getting so much new information every day, more and more, and of course, much information can be faked, maybe it's so hard to tell what's true and what's not true that this huge amount of new information from the digital world cannot be processed effectively and therefore doesn't translate into productivity growth. And then there's a conspicuous consumption-based possible explanation of the Solow paradox. New tech is nothing more than a wasteful status good for companies and individuals. Wait a second, what if AI is just the new toy? It doesn't do anything for productivity. It's just kind of looks good. It's a status good. If you don't have it, you're a loser. You're in behind. But what if it's just some marketed toy that really doesn't have a lot of impact on productivity and it wastes as much time as it saves you? That's possible. Of course, we need a lot of study on that. That's hard to pull apart statistically. There could be a bandwagon effect related to this. New tech is not that useful, maybe. Maybe it causes as much inefficiency as you gain in efficiencies, but it's being adopted out of an irrational fear of missing out, or FOMO. You don't want to be the person that's not on the bandwagon. You don't want to be left behind. You don't want people to think of your business, for example, as an antiquated business that doesn't have a good business model. You have to go and join the AI revolution or the computer revolution or the internet revolution to not have that perception of yourself. Maybe it's a coordination problem. New tech benefits one firm, maybe. Maybe there are productivity gains for each firm, but those firms are competing with each other. So as all the firms adopt AI technology or internet technology or computers, they kind of, through competition, erase each other's productivity gains. So that is a coordination problem. They're better off not having adopted all of them together, not having adopted that technology in the first place because it didn't give them any gains. However, if you're the only one that doesn't adopt that technology, you get buried, you're out of business. But when you add up the whole business, everybody adopting the technology does not increase productivity. So that's a coordination problem. Maybe you have to solve it by having some sort of government regulation about tech adoption so that we don't do wasteful spending on useless tech. Because make no mistake, on computers, on internet, and on AI, some massive amounts of money are being spended. And according to the way that this paradox is solved, that might be wasted money. Maybe there's productivity benefits. Maybe there's just benefits in it being a consumption good that's fun to play with, but it's a lot of money that we are using as a society in the global economy to make these transitions to different technologies, and we don't see productivity benefits from it so far. So it's really important to study that stuff, and these are just some ways you might do that from an institutional economics perspective. We don't have the answers on these. We don't know which ones of these are good questions or bad questions, but we need them to be solved, and we need a lot of people working on the problems to solve them. So that's the institutional economics. We're going to, in Module 5, we're done with that. The next time we're going to talk about what I'm going to frame as a form of institutional economics, this broad Keynesian economics. And this is that theory that we've already touched on a lot. That's the economics that was most prevalent from the end of the Second World War up until around 1980 when this neoclassical economics took over. So that'll be our interesting story for next time.